Welcome to everything you ever wanted to know about Virginia voting rights and beyond. My name is Jorna Taylor, and I am the Executive Director of the Virginia Civic Engagement Table. What does that mean? It means that I get to work with about 30 nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations who advocate on everything from the environment to voting rights, social justice, healthcare, immigration reform, and bring them together, and hopefully we all work better together because we're stronger and we're advancing a more progressive Virginia and passing good public policy that affects real people in their everyday lives. But what really gets me out of bed in the morning, and I think I would speak for these ladies as well, is a passion for voting rights. I know, it's pretty sexy. It's pretty exciting. Voting rights, election law, the administration of elections. But the work is so important. So I actually just want to get everybody sort of out of their afternoon, almost the end of the day, gonna go home soon comas. So I want to ask a couple of questions. One, what are some of the top issues, and yell these out, top issues besides immigration reform that are facing all of our communities and our families?
Jobs.
Jobs. Oh, come on, that's it? Just jobs? What about the affordable care? Healthcare! I knew somebody would say it. What else? When we turn on the sink, we want to make sure that we have what to drink? Clean water, okay. So all of these issues, healthcare, immigration reform, voting rights, sustainable environment, who makes the laws that affect all of these things when they're there? When they are doing their job? Anyone?
Yeah. Bankers.
True, but
well, at state level,
exactly. So our folks, the General Assembly, when they go into session in January down in Richmond, are making the laws around Virginia, and Congress, when the government isn't in shutdown, is making laws for the country. And so what is one of the best ways that we can influence those people? What can we do to influence those people?
We'll make ourselves heard.
By?
Well, emails, letters, phone calls.
Exactly. Both of those things. Voting and direct advocacy.
Yes.
So, show of hands, how many of you are registered to vote? And how many of you voted in the last presidential election? And how many of you have a plan to take at least one friend, family member, person from your community to vote on November 5th? So you have about 32 days to figure that out.
Well, I won't take them, but I've got some encouraging.
There. See,
yes.
You have a plan. You have a plan to get your community to vote.
And a couple, and some, whichever of my ESOL students are registered, I'm pushing them to.
That's great. So, because all these issues that we just talked about, it doesn't make a difference if we don't actually use our voice, go to the ballot box, and have our say about who's representing us, right? We can complain all we want, but if we don't participate in the process, then we really have no right to have those sorts of complaints. So, we've seen the legislative attacks. We will continue to see the legislative attacks. We will continue to see folks try and make it harder for people to vote. But we're here today to talk to you about what we can do about that, what we have been doing, and how you can get involved in protecting our democracy and making sure that every eligible voter who wants to participate has that right. So I will allow my esteemed panelists here, colleagues, to introduce themselves.
Great. So thanks, Jorna, for the wonderful introduction to the panel. My name's Tran Nguyen. I am with Virginia New Majority. Why this is important to me personally and as an organization. We were founded in 2007. How many folks here remember the 2006 fight for comprehensive immigration reform? Where, across the country, millions and millions of people took to the streets and, held rallies, and we thought that was a year. That was supposed to be the year that we, got comprehensive immigration reform. Something was going to happen. It was just in the air. fast forward 7 years later, and we're still fighting, right? Our analysis after that, I mean, because even here in Virginia, we swarmed the streets. We brought people to D.C. Immigrants were on the streets. They weren't afraid. Our analysis at that time was part of the reason why we lost was because immigrants weren't engaged beyond that activism level, right? We weren't voting, frankly. We weren't registered to vote, and we weren't voting. So it was one thing to be out in the streets and saying, hey, we want this, but when push came to shove, the elected officials were, well, you're not voting for me, I'm going to listen to people that actually vote for me. And so we knew that it was critical that we had to engage new Americans in a very strategic and deliberate way to actually have their voices heard in a way that elected officials would actually listen to. And frankly, that's voting. We don't have the money, like the bankers do, to influence elections or do whatever, but we have our people power. We have the power of the ballot. And so we were founded in 2007 specifically for that. We are a statewide civic engagement organization that basically goes out and educates voters of color around issues that are important to them, whether it's healthcare, whether it's immigration reform, voting rights, and we register people to vote, and then we do voter education and then get out the vote activities. We frankly make sure that people are able to cast their ballots come November. So this issue is near and dear to me for no other reason because of everything that Jordan outlined. We cannot impact any issue that we care about if we don't have access to the ballot box, because frankly that's what it's going to work, what people listen to. So we've been in this fight in Virginia around voting rights and election administration for a number of years. During the state legislative session, I'm down in Richmond full time, advocating and lobbying on a number of election administration issues, working with partners, national partners who you'll hear from in a bit, and state partners like the ACLU and the League of Women Voters, and just trying to make sure that our elections are fair and accessible.
Hi everyone, my name is Arandi Zamora and I'm with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And we're based in DC. We're a national organization and we work closely with our partners here in Virginia. The organization itself has been around since 1963, so we just had our 50th anniversary this year. And voting rights is one of our main project areas. We feel like it's one of our most fundamental rights for the reasons that they have already outlined, and I won't repeat. But personally, to me as well, voting is really important because as an immigrant, immigration reform and just access to healthcare, equal treatment are all things that are very important to me. And I think that getting our community mobilized and ensuring that they have equal access to the ballot is really important. So that's why we're here. So my organization does a lot of work in litigation. So we file a lot of cases to protect voting rights throughout the nation. But we also work in a different capacity through the Election Protection Coalition, which is a national coalition of organizations, local and national organizations. And we're very, very nonpartisan. We have two purposes. The coalition has been around since 2001, and in response to the Gore-Bush disaster, there were a lot of problems that were highlighted by that election, and so that mobilized organizations to come together and try to protect the vote. So our two purposes are, first, to assist voters, ensure that all eligible voters have a meaningful opportunity to cast a ballot on election day. And we do that by answering calls throughout the year. We have a national hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, and also in Spanish, 888-VEYVOTA. So voters throughout the nation anytime can call and ask a question about how to register to vote, what are the qualifications, where can I find my polling place? Or they can report problems like, I got this call telling me that I could actually vote online, is that true? Or, I'm a student at this university and we received a letter telling us that we cannot register to vote or else we will lose our funds or in-state tuition. And so then we work with election officials, we work with the school administrators or anybody that is involved to try to fix these problems before Election Day. On Election Day, we also deploy a number of volunteers, a big number of volunteers. During the last election, we had over 5,000 volunteers throughout the country doing voter protection. So we have folks answering phones because calls are just off the hook on Election Day. But we also have people going from precinct to precinct, making sure that things are running smoothly. If a machine broke down, we contact the election officials, make sure that they know that the machine is broken down, and maybe sometimes in the mornings, folks maybe lost the key or they overslept, so they don't open up the polling place at the time that they're supposed to. We make sure that the election officials know and they're sending somebody over. Sometimes it's a matter of voter intimidation. There's somebody there who is, behind the voters or trying to see who they're going to vote for, or trying to ask them or encourage. Maybe encourage is too positive of a word, but intimidating them into voting for a specific individual where in an area where they're not supposed to be doing that. So these are all problems that our volunteers detect on Election Day, and then we try to solve them there on the spot to make sure that the elections are fair and accessible for all. Another thing that we do is we gather all this information that comes in through the hotline or that our volunteers see, and we compile a report. We did it during the 2012 elections, and it highlights the problems, the positive things that we saw in the election, and then we use that then to advocate for better protections for administrative reforms. Let's see, so this year here in Virginia, we will have a program, so we're looking for volunteers to help us monitor the polls and also take calls on Election Day. So I'll pass around a couple of flyers that have that information. As you heard, I'm blanking on her name, Caroline. She is looking for bilingual poll workers because as of 2011, Fairfax became a covered jurisdiction under Section 203, which means that they have to provide the materials and assistance in Spanish because there's a large population of Spanish-speaking voters here. So on Election Day, we will also be helping these voters, making sure that the county is actually in compliance, and if not, we'll document that and try to work with the county to fix that for the next election. Let's see. So in November, we will be covering Arlington, Alexandria, Prince William County, Fairfax, Richmond, Herndon, and Tidewater, and we're looking for volunteers for that, so I'll pass out that information.
Thank you. So who else is their favorite day is Election Day of the year? Because it's mine, and it's awesome, and I love Election Day, and I love democracy, and I love watching the participation of the process, and I really love election protection. So we work with the Lawyers Committee. Tram and I work with the Lawyers Committee to pull together sort of the grassroots, non-lawyer, I only watch Law and Order, don't have my law degree yet, but I'm working on it from the Cracker Jack box type piece. So what that means is that we recruit folks to be the eyes and ears on the ground as well. And they work with one of us in a particular region, and we say, we just got a call from that hotline that said there's something fishy going on in Virginia Beach Precinct 27. Could you go over there and check that out? And then, we send our non-lawyer teams, and they super sleuth around, and they call back and they say, yep, all taken care of, it was just some confusion. Or they say, no, we need to get one of the lawyers involved. And we do this across the state. And it's really, the first time I did it in 2002, I thought, I was like, oh, this is going to be so boring and silly. And you know what? It's so much fun. You get to see democracy in action, and it's so much fun. And I sent one of my volunteers out to a precinct in Norfolk last year, and he said, oh my God, he calls it, Congressman Scott's here. This is so cool. He's talking to voters. So, it's an exciting day. But we need volunteers to do that. And we work with these lawyers, and we are completely nonpartisan. We don't care who you're voting for. We think that if you want to go and vote, and you are eligible to vote, we want to help you do that. But I want to be very, very clear. We also work on poll worker recruitment, because the first defense to make sure that elections run smoothly are well-trained, well-educated, up-to-speed poll workers. All poll workers are there to help voters vote. By no means are we saying that poll workers are trying to impede the process, but has anybody been a poll worker or is a poll worker in this room? So you probably know, if you've been a poll worker, that the training is good, but it's not that long, and there's a lot of people in the room, and I'm not sure that everybody probably gets their questions asked all the time. That there's a lot of nuances to Virginia law and different things where
Well, mostly it's people that come in and they're in the wrong place, and it's 5 minutes before closing, so it's kind of a disaster.
Exactly. So there's just a lot of sort of little things that can go wrong unintentionally. So we also want to make sure that we have enough poll workers to fill those needs, as well as poll workers who have access to all of the information that they need. So that is sort of election day, and if nobody's doing anything on election day, you should certainly talk to us to take part in the fabulous nonpartisan election protection program. Tram, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the legislative pieces?
Yeah, so as Arandi mentioned, a lot of the information that's collected on election day from the voter protection hotline gets aggregated, right? And so we're able to analyze some of the election day issues after the elections, just to sort of see what the biggest problems were. So in 2012, there were a lot of lines, and you couldn't miss that. It was in the news all the time. There was one precinct in Prince William County that at 10 o'clock at night, I was still driving down there because my poll monitors, my volunteers are still out there being like, Tram, we just brought back pizza for everybody because people are still in line. So long lines clearly was a problem. There was some confusion on election day around Virginia's ID laws, whether Virginia actually had a photo ID or didn't, because so many other states have enacted photo ID. And so we were able to kind of take a look at some of the problems that happen on election day to see, what can we do to fix this? What are some of the biggest problems that we saw on election day, and what are some fixes that we can actually do to take care of it, legislative fixes? And so, if you look at the long lines, you're like, all right, well, if we could encourage more people to vote absentee, whether absentee by mail or absentee in person, because Virginia allows both of those, then maybe we'll alleviate the number of folks that actually show up on election day. So we took a look at the absentee process and what the requirements are to vote absentee, and so, are there some things that we can do around absentee voting to alleviate lines? It was a resource issue. There weren't enough machines, frankly, in a lot of polling locations. And Virginia has a moratorium on whether or not jurisdictions can purchase new DRE machines. They can't. And so, there's all these issues with resources. Electronic poll books aren't available everywhere, which makes the ease of checking people in to vote a lot easier. So it was a resource question. So hey, are there legislative fixes that we can make to alleviate or increase resources for registrars that will help with the long lines? Okay, the ID was a problem. Well, is there, can we do some advocacy? It's not a legislative fix, but can we work with the State Board of Elections to make sure that their trainings cover the ID a little bit more? Or clarify for their election officers a little better in terms of what's required and what's not. And so all of that stuff, all of that election day information is super critical for our ongoing work. We take all this information, we work with legislators in Virginia to come up with, to draft bills that can get introduced that we will advocate for and fight for to make sure that our elections run smoothly. We all hear in the news about photo ID or, voter fraud and voter suppression efforts and all of these things. At the end of the day, what we want, again, for democracy to really work is that our elections and the election administration is efficient, runs smoothly, so everybody who's eligible to cast a ballot can cast a ballot. And so sometimes, frankly, they're not sexy things. They're not sexy issues.
They're fun.
But they're critical. I mean, think about it, how critical it is. This is the cornerstone of our democracy. This is the cornerstone of how we advocate and how we fight for issues that are near and dear to us. And so as sexy as, asking for more money so registrars can purchase 10 additional machines is, it's still important because it's like a clock, right? Like all the pieces have to fit and work efficiently in order for the clock to keep going. That's what kind of elections are. So that's what we do at the state level. Last year, this past session, the 2013 session, and has anybody here done state level advocacy or experienced the General Assembly before? So a couple of folks. So let me tell you, it is fun. And I say that with a hint of, it's a love-hate thing. So Virginia's legislative session is short. In odd years, it's a 45-day session. In even years, it's a 60-day session. Which means between 45 and 60 days, our General Assembly members are voting on an average of 3,000 bills. So you can imagine the lightning speed that things are moving, right? And you can imagine that oftentimes a lot of legislators don't really quite understand the issue well enough, but there isn't a whole lot of time, and so it's really up to us, not us as advocates, but us broadly as citizens of Virginia that care about issues to really engage. Pick up the phone, call your legislator, email them. They actually do really pay attention because, again, this happens in the dead of winter. Sessions January and February. Like, it's in the dead of winter, they're in Richmond, nobody's really paying attention. And so for the folks that do pay attention, they actually do really listen. And they take your opinion into account. So this past session, we had some setbacks, not gonna lie, but we also had some victories. And we're going to continue to build upon some of those victories in this upcoming January session to see if we can make election administration a little bit better. So I'm just going to point out a couple of highlights in terms of some stuff that happened legislatively, and then we can sort of, make it more conversational, and you all can chime in terms of what you think is necessary to protect the vote in Virginia. So I'll first kind of go with some of the lowlights, just to get that out of the way. So yes, Virginia now passed a photo ID bill that will start and become in effect July 1st of 2014. So it's not in effect for this year. So this November, people do not have to show photo ID. Cannot emphasize that enough. People do not have to show photo ID this year. So that did pass. They're still working on details as to what requirements they need to be met in order for people to obtain their ID. They are free in the sense that it won't cost them for the actual ID. Whether there's other costs associated, details are being worked out. It's a low light. Another low light, folks may have heard of some list maintenance, voter purge issues in Florida around matching.
Frequently will do kind of honeypot type sting operations where they try to ensnare immigrants who they consider are seeking to bribe their way into a legal status that they're not entitled to. I have problems with those operations, but why can't USCIS also put some of those same resources into honeypot stings for some of these notarios? Instead of setting up a fake immigration officer to try to solicit bribes from immigrants, why don't they send someone in undercover to essentially look at some of these notarios who, again, as we just saw, are advertising in the newspaper and on their storefronts. It's not like you need to crawl under rocks to find them. So I think there's a lot more that the government agencies could be doing in this regard as well, and I think we need to really pressure them to do that as well.
So thank you, Simon. So aside from nonprofits, government is actually doing something that I think, but one of the big problems is that, like everyone else, they're short on resources and there are so many more bad guys than good guys. In fact, a good example is the shutdown right now. We're supposed to have someone from the Federal Trade Commission today, but because of the shutdown, she's not able to make it. She's not allowed to be here. So I'm just going to say a few words on her behalf. Downstairs, you'll find flyers in in Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese, Haitian Creole. They have other things that you can pick up that will tell you about if you're a victim of fraud, whether it's notarial affinity fraud, whatever it is, you can report online. In addition, other government agencies, CFPB, Department of Justice, State Attorney General's Office, local police departments are all trying to fight fraud in our communities, along with our nonprofit and community members like yourselves. So you could also get more of that information. There is a financial scams alert event by the Fairfax Police, Thursday, October 10th to 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. in Annandale. The furniture is also downstairs. So again, pick those up, go contact nonprofits, government agencies, etc. One thing that they came up with recently is the FTC came up with consumer.gov/immigrant help, which is a list of resources in the Maryland, Virginia, DC area that you could turn to if you or someone you know is a victim of fraud. That said, let's move on. We have finally Miss Roxanna Miller, who is currently a law student at the University of Virginia School of Law. As it relates to notarial fraud, Roxanna has done extensive research on this issue with her colleagues, with support of her law school, Legal Justice Center, FACA Lao, Ayuda, so many other folks that she's interviewed. She's written a paper on how to campaign to stop notarial fraud in Virginia. Roxanna, can you tell us about what you found and some of the suggestions that you have for us?
Yes, Dan. I actually have a PowerPoint presentation. I'll go ahead and pull that up. And basically today I'm just briefly going to talk about possible legislative action that we can take here in the Commonwealth to try and prevent notarial fraud. Now, as we have heard today from Andy and as many of you know, the recent immigration reform efforts, have really led to an increase in the number of individuals who misrepresent themselves as being able to provide immigration services. And notarial fraud has really become a pressing issue here in Virginia. For one of the reasons is that Virginia has a substantial and expanding immigrant community that is specifically vulnerable to notarial fraud. In fact, Virginia has the 9th largest immigrant population in the United States as a whole. Despite these facts, Virginia is still 1 out of 20 states without any law specifically addressing notarial fraud. And Virginia is also 1 out of 24 states without any laws regulating the way in which notaries can advertise. As we have heard from Simon and Annie today, one of the factors really facilitating notarial fraud are these types of advertisements that you have seen Annie show you as well. And the problem is that individuals who are notaries, and sometimes who are not notaries, are literally translating from English into foreign languages words like notary. And like Annie mentioned, notary, which in Spanish, for example, would be notario, is synonymous with a lawyer. So a person who sees this and is seeking immigration advice will go to them believing that they are in fact authorized to give them advice on immigration matters, when in fact we know that they are not. So passing a statute that would regulate notary advertising has two main goals. And the first goal is to try and prevent fraud before it occurs, before it causes harm to any specific person. And a statute that regulates the way in which notaries can advertise achieves this by severely limiting the modes that notaries commonly use to attract possible victims. The second goal is to facilitate that identification of notaries. So for example, it's much easier to prove that an individual has violated a statute that requires that they advertise in a certain way than it is to prove that they have provided unauthorized immigration advice to anyone. So as part of a research project for my law school, I worked with a few colleagues and we came up with specific language for this type of legislation here in Virginia. Section A would say every notary public who is not an attorney or an accredited immigration representative who advertises the services of a notary shall include in the advertisement this specific notice. I am not an attorney licensed to practice law in Virginia and may not give legal advice or accept fees for legal advice. Now in the previous session, we had a few recommendations to just cross out the Virginia part and just say I'm not an attorney licensed to practice law, period, or licensed to practice law in the United States, and that's a great suggestion that we're definitely going to take on. And now this section also prohibits individuals from literally translating English words into a foreign language that will mislead someone into believing that they are authorized to provide immigration services. So some of the prohibited translations include notary public, notary, licensed, lawyer, or attorney. For example, a notary who is seeking a Spanish audience or who is trying to attract Spanish audiences cannot use the word notario, notario público, licenciado, or abogado. The statute will have 3 different penalties. And your first violation will lead to a fine of $1,000, and then each time that you violate the statute, a penalty will be added to that $1,000 fine. A second violation will lead to the suspension of notary authorization, and then the third one will lead to the permanent revocation of the Notaries Commission. That statute also will include a section that requires that all notaries post at their place of business a schedule of fees which they are allowed to charge under the law, to ensure that individuals who are going to them understand that the law requires that they only charge a specific amount for the services that they are providing. And as Annie has said, we really require, for this type of legislation to really be effective, we require some sort of outreach program and education program, letting individuals understand the problems that arise from notarial fraud. This type of statute will be seriously undermined if we aren't advocating it and letting know individuals the problems that are involved with notarial fraud. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have two nonprofit companies talk about some of the things that they've seen and get proposed legislative fix that's really up to the community for you guys to help that out. Now at this point we'll just open it up if you have any sort of questions, comments. Anyone in the audience? Yes.
I have a question. We ask for income for our program, usually asking for taxes, and sometimes we have families who use tax IDs to do their taxes, and in certain cases their taxes have been done improperly and they have gone ahead and just done the procedure, but not knowing because they were not well aware of how it was done. So when it is brought up and we let them know it looks like something's missing, why aren't your kids on there as dependents? And they say, oh, they told me I didn't have to put them on there. Who do they contact for things like that? Because that is something that's being taken away from them. They're taken advantage of because they're unaware. Do they contact IUDA for that? Or is that because it's not an immigration status issue because it has nothing to do with application for immigration? Who do they contact?
We think it's related. And I guess there are two things. So one of them is that unlike practicing law, for tax preparers, the bar is extremely low as far as what you have to do. All you have to do is really sign up with the IRS. There is a list. There's a private company that bought through the Freedom of Information Act the list of all the people who are registered as tax preparers, so you can look up a person to at least see if they are registered as a tax preparer. And if they are not, then that could be reported probably the Federal Trade Commission, or directly to the IRS.
But in terms of just fixing the problem and getting them like an amended tax filing and getting a refund, I'm given to understand that it's really not all that difficult. That pretty much any legit accountant can essentially redo a previous year's filing. But there are really a lot of bad actors. And just to kind of pile on to that, the Senate bill, immigration reform, at least as it passed the Senate, and probably this provision would make it through into any final legislation, requires that people be up to date on their back taxes in order to essentially advance up the ladder towards citizenship. So there's going to be a tremendous influx of persons who want to get right with the IRS for previous years that they've been working. Now, a lot of these folks are actually going to owe next to no money because they weren't making all that much to begin with. But that's the perfect excuse for fraudulent tax preparers to essentially charge them an arm and a leg. And again, it's just like in immigration with taxes, if you get defrauded, you've lost money to the fraudster, but then you've also possibly lost your opportunity to claim deductions, etc.
There are tax clinics that we could, if you see this come up, give us a call and we can try and refer to the right place for somebody who can do the job the right way. But we definitely have seen more than once tax preparers provide immigration services. So a lot of the businesses that we're looking at provide a lot more than just immigration legal advice. They do travel services, they do remittance sending, and they do taxes. And so let me know,
Thank you.
Next question? Yeah.
Okay, I've got two things. How proactive does someone have to be for the U visa if they find themselves as part of a police investigation? Is it the person's, the immigrant's responsibility to ask the police to certify them, or is that something that you have to wait for the police to offer? How does that conversation start?
In 100% of all cases, you have to go ahead and answer. I mean, I am not aware of any single case in which the police on their own have said,
I didn't think so.
We'd be happy to certify for you. You've been very helpful. We'd be happy to certify for you. The legal standard for certification is fairly low. you have to have essentially, I mean, I'm not going to say the exact words because I don't recall them, but you have to essentially have not refused to, any reasonable request for cooperation. So you don't have to have, gone above and beyond and worn a wire and, gone in and done a sting operation. You have to simply not refused. Like, if they call you to testify and you don't show, then you've refused. You simply have to have not refused. That being said, again, each individual jurisdiction has free reign to decide whether or not they're going to certify, in what circumstances. USCIS, to its credit, Department of Homeland Security has put out some very useful guidance for the local jurisdictions, but it's just guidance. The local jurisdictions essentially have free reign to do whatever they want. So on a state level, one of the things that we think would be very useful, probably wouldn't happen under the current administration, might happen under the next administration, depending on what administration it is, would be if essentially if the state police would put out guidelines for all the agencies in the state saying, y'all should be certifying U visas, and here are the criteria you should look at when certifying. Because I think, the Goochland County Sheriff's Office is going to take a lot more seriously guidance from the state police than they are a sort of nationwide manual that's put out by DHS.
What is a U visa? I'm sorry I came in late.
I was going to add to that, but a U visa is for a victim of crime who has helped the law enforcement. So there are certain crimes that qualify, and another element, just to add to that, is not only do you need the police to certify, that's not always enough. You can file a U visa and still be denied by USCIS because you haven't satisfied the other element, which is substantial harm, so physical or mental harm. And so that's clearly, an issue sometimes with these cases, is being able to prove that mental harm. And there are cases where the facts show that this individual was really affected to the point where it had a very damaging effect on their life.
She had a follow-up question.
I did. It was mainly for Roxanna. This presentation you gave, there's not currently any legislation being prepared for Virginia's next session. These are just effective measures that you have found.
We are currently working with Back Aloud to try and push these types of legislations into the General Assembly this year.
Okay.
So we're hoping that we can.
Okay.
And this is from other jurisdictions that you found something similar, right?
Yes, and actually, so a lot of the language that we found mimic different statutes that have been passed in several states, like Arizona, Oregon, and all these different states. So it's not new.
Right. So this is just kind of, you just put together a draft legislation.
That's correct.
Okay. Great.
Yes. Apologize. My comment and my question at the end will be challenging your position. Not because I am in defense of the criminal who commit these acts. It's because, unfortunately, I have not heard from you the social problem about this presentation, which is that when the person who needs the immigrant services go to the lawyer for fill up the application for only, for instance, naturalization, the lawyer charged $2,000. Those kind of criminals charge $300, $400, and the person who with low income taxes goes over this person. First of all, second around, if the person goes any non-profit organization who can help them, the non-profit organization says, in many cases we have heavy low cases, and we cannot help to you at this point, at this time. First of all. Second, when I noticed that you speak about prosecution of those criminals, but you don't go so over the problem to give the solution that at least the state of California have the solution, because the position, and unfortunately, in my humble opinion, I see is that it's only prosecute this kind of criminal, but not give the solution, the integral solution for the problem for the applicant, the people in need for immigrant services to render some service with affordable payments. And the state of California have a registered immigrant consultant a list certified and with all checklists that they have this state of. Why you don't work instead to prosecute the criminals in some legislation in the state of Virginia to get some people that can help with all the
That's a really interesting point. You guys have
We've definitely talked about this all the time at IUDA. So we think that this project, we want to end the project as soon as we can, because the idea is to really go after the individuals who are the most unscrupulous. So the folks who are posing as ICE impersonators or telling people that they can sign up for a line. We know that there are a lot of good businesses, good actors in the community as well. I guess there's two issues that we've seen. Sometimes we see folks who actually bring clients to IUDA and say, this has gone beyond what I know anything about, and I'd like you to help this client now. And that's a notario who's coming into IUDA to seek sort of further services. What USCIS often says, their slogan is, the wrong help can't hurt. And so what the concern about that is that there would have to be some more training and some more bringing people into the fold under the supervision of an attorney. And there need to be more accredited representatives or people who are, the special consultants in California, the California bar will say that has completely failed. I was just at a conference with them and they say that the program has not worked and they have more problems than they started with. So I don't know if that's the answer, but I think that after we are able to maybe take out the bad actors, being able to put more of the good actors into the fold of the community is probably going to be necessary, because there's no way that if comprehensive immigration reform goes through that we'll be able to meet the need. There's already.
The punctual question would be, it wouldn't be better to look for a solution with some kind of a certified agent like the IRS has, and immigration can work with that, because Board of Immigration Appeal has that for people who work in non-profit organization. But it can be the state to the private with all the law regulations that they can comply. Don't you think that it would be better way to find some solution, not only to avoid the criminal activity, to serve the community?
I think that with the caveat that even a very simple service, immigration and tax law are considered the most difficult areas of law. And so even with a very simple service like being able to apply for advanced parole so that a person with temporary protected status can travel home can turn into a life-changing experience. And so unfortunately you have businesses who provide that service for $60, it's 2 pages, they fill it out, they send it in, and then we're working with a client who is now stuck in El Salvador because the service was not provided well and the person did not follow up because they didn't know how to follow up. And ideally an attorney would know how to follow up. That's not always the case. We know that through this project we've uncovered a lot of problems with the immigration bar as well, and certainly attorneys aren't immune to this problem in the sense that there are immigration attorneys or attorneys who are providing the service and they're not competent to provide the service. So at the end of the day, it's really about who is going to be able to provide the best, most competent service, and I do think that there needs to be more people brought into the fold to meet the need.
I think the discretion, the legal discretion that needs to be exercised in the practice of immigration law and helping people with immigration is not in filling out the forms. It's in deciding which forms to fill out and when, right? So refer to the naturalization application. It's a 10-page form, but it's anyone in this room, any one of you could fill out a naturalization form and do it right if I gave you someone with an incredibly straightforward immigration history. The problem is not knowing how to write address where it says address and knowing how to write name where it says name. The problem is in knowing whether this person should in fact file for naturalization, whether they even qualify in the first place. And as immigration law has become, over the past 20 years, more inextricably bound up with the criminal law, and as the criminal law of all 50 states is different and doesn't quite mesh with the immigration law, and as, in my experience, the number of people who don't have any criminal conviction whatsoever in their history, obviously there are people who are squeaky clean, but they're not the majority. People have done all kinds of stuff. That's where it starts to get really tricky, right? So again, even with TPS, the TPS form is a 1-page form, but knowing whether this person should or should not file the TPS form, that's where the legal discretion comes in. And I don't think that, that's the kind of thing that essentially profit-driven notarios can be trusted to do correctly, even if they were given a little more training. Right, so it is true that an immigration lawyer is charging $2,000 to fill out a naturalization application. Not everyone needs to do that, but anyone who's got any convictions on their record would be well advised to do that. And finally, I'll point out that Ogata Immigrant Services will do your naturalization for like 150. Granted, you'll have to wait a lot longer to get an appointment with them, but you know, I mean.
I think that's a really good point. I think one of the problems is that we don't have affordable legal services for so many people. So that's definitely a good, you know, something that you noticed, and I appreciate. I think there was a question out there.
Mine was actually just follow on. We were talking about the U visa. We have a lot of clients that we see that are undocumented, and they do work, and then they don't get paid. So my question is probably for the lawyer. Is that considered fraud, straight fraud? Or would they be considered a victim of a crime that they could then try and negotiate a U visa out of it? Would it depend on the dollar amount?
It's funny you should ask that. So, in the, I would argue that it could constitute fraud, it could constitute theft by false pretenses, a number of things. Neither of those crimes in and of themselves get you a U visa are sufficient. However, if the guy calls his boss and says, hey man, how come you have to pay me? It's been 3 weeks since the job ended. And the boss says, what are you going to do about it? If you come after me, I'm going to call immigration and they'll be on your doorstep. Then it's crossed the line into extortion. That being said, getting even a case of that nature, even in Fairfax, which is one of the best jurisdictions nationwide when it comes to U visa issues, getting the Fairfax police to take a matter of that nature seriously is difficult and is not something that the person is likely to be able to do on their own, unfortunately.
So so I'll just say a few last words just to wrap this up. So thank you for coming today. You know, immigrant fraud, I think, is a gigantic problem, as I mentioned in the beginning. It's really a problem of trust that people take advantage of. You know, it's someone you trust the most. You speak the same language, they look like you, and then next thing you know, boom, they use that against to take every cent you have, right? So in context of immigration reform, when the Senate passed it, the CIR didn't pass, National Immigrant Law Center, which doesn't even do any law, and the CIR didn't pass, they got tons of calls saying, you know, how can I adjust my status? People take advantage of that. Right now, the Affordable Care Act is being implemented, and you know, people didn't know the difference. There's a Jimmy Fallon thing going on right now. People don't know the difference between Affordable Care Act and Obamacare. They think it's different. People take advantage of that, and people who speak your language will definitely take advantage of that. And really, you know, nothing helps more than prevention and the right laws that the lawyers could use. So I'm going to leave it up to these wonderful folks to say final few words. Roxanna?
Right. So it's really important, like Dan just mentioned, to really try and prevent notarial fraud from the outset. And this is exactly what this legislation tries to achieve. I understand that there are different avenues that we also need to take to support this type of legislation for it to be effective.
And where there's already been victimization, where there's already someone who's been affected and their immigration case has been affected, we would really encourage folks to refer them to Project End and to see if we can either refer it to another jurisdiction if it's outside of DC or to address the problem head on.
When immigration reform comes, when legalization comes, the flood and crush of work will be unlike anything we've ever seen in the history of this country, and I'm including the 86 legalization. How do we rise to that challenge? There won't be enough lawyers in the entire country to handle, you know, just what the number of applications we would see in the DC area, metro area alone. How do we handle that crush? How do we rise to that challenge without letting some of these fraudsters essentially in our doors and let them continue to take advantage of people, but this time under our name?
So thank you very much. So let's give them a round of applause. The day's not over. The fun continues, and please go back to the sanctuary. They're going to have a few more things to do. And, you know, close out. Thank you for coming today.